Prime Minister Tony Abbott, welcome, and it's great for you to be able to join with me in a conversation about the book on Dignity and Prosperity, the Future of Liberal Australia. As you're aware, in the book we've tried to bring together many of the Liberal titans and thought leaders, the thinkers, the change makers of the past, to hopefully give some inspiration to the current generation and future generations about the importance of liberalism. And I appreciate you having contributed the Afterword, and I'll ask you a few questions about that because there's a few things there. Plus also I'd like to get your thoughts on some of the challenges and lessons that you in particular bring to where we're at the moment in the centre-right of the Australian polity. So in your Afterword you mentioned the word the golden age. And I think most Australians, of all political persuasions I dare say, would look at the Howard period as a golden age. But it wasn't an easy given task at all, as you know as a senior member of that government. It's now looked back as if it was easy, but it was far from easy to deliver that. But there are many lessons, I guess, from that period of good government that we can see. And the other period that we refer to a bit in the book and look back to, of course, is the other great Liberal Prime Minister of a long standing, and that is, of course, our first founder in Sir Robert Menzies, who again had to overcome adversity and then put in place a government that at times was in many ways a bit like John Howard, I see, the two of them, in that they were initially both regarded as from a bygone era. And yet they became the epitome of the modern liberalism and party and government for long periods of prosperity. So I think golden age is very fitting. So if we look at that period and then we see the periods in between, and you allude to the period including your time as Prime Minister, which was cut short, but there was a lot achieved there as well, and then subsequent. And many Liberals, I think, would say that we were disappointed. They were let down. In the same way, at the end of the Fraser period, we went through, I think, a same period of understanding that, well, why did we not do more with the government? So you were a key player there, and I don't want to dwell over all of the things that went on during that period of time, but how do you compare and contrast the golden age of Howard and the not quite as well delivered period of the last three Liberal leaders and now where we're at?
Well, it's a very fair question you put to me, David, and you're right. The Menzies era was a great period for the Liberal Party. The Howard era was a great period for the Liberal Party. The Fraser era less so, and the Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison era even less so. A government that was elected with high hopes in 2013 to be at least as good as Howard ended up being, in many respects, not even as good as Fraser. Why? Well, I think the revolving door prime ministership didn't help, but I also think that, as Paul Keating once said, you change the prime minister, you change the country. You had really a Howard-style opening prime minister. You then had perhaps a very different middle prime minister, and then you had a guy at the end who was kind of a bit of each. And I think that all added up to a government which, at least after 2015, wasn't really sure what it was trying to do. I've always said that the Liberal Party succeeds when it's strongly led from the centre-right, certainly at the federal level. That's what the record shows. The government, the Liberal Party succeeds when it's strongly led from the centre-right. Whatever else you say about Malcolm Turnbull, I don't really think he's a centre-right politician. It's often said by Labor figures that he was courting the Labor Party in an earlier period of his public life. Certainly, his leadership foundered twice when he wanted the Liberal Party to embrace Labor's energy policies. So I think what we had from 2015 through to 2018 was a centre-right government led by someone who was instinctively of the centre-left, and I think that was always going to be a problem. Scott Morrison looked to be a return to the centre-right, and certainly he and Josh Frydenberg campaigned extremely strongly against Labor's high tax, over-the-top climate policy in 2019. Yeah. But then, with the net zero commitment, seemed to engage in a surrender on climate policy, and then in response to the pandemic, really became a very high-spending government themselves. Now, I accept that the pandemic was a very unusual situation, but I do think that the government overreacted to it. I think most governments, except the Swedish government, overreacted to it. And I think that the most disappointing aspect of the final term of the recent coalition government was the way we spent massively and connived at extraordinary restrictions on human freedom by the states. And I think that was difficult for people on the conservative side of politics to accept, given that if there are two things that are at the very core of centre-right thinking, it's budget responsibility and human freedom, and spending massively and imposing unprecedented restrictions on human freedom or cooperating in that just didn't seem like a very liberal thing to do.
No, very true. And if we compare some of the differences of government, do you think it's hard, and this might seem personal, but to follow somebody like John Howard or somebody like Robert Menzies? It must be a difficult thing for a party to both be renew itself with new leadership and new ideas, but equally pay appropriate homage to those legends who are still around. Do you think that means that you need a period, perhaps a longer period, to reconsider what you stand for and how do you take the best of the past, bring it to the current environment and then take it forward when you're looking? And the reason I raise that is you've highlighted something which I find interesting, because you and I both worked in different ways on Fight Back, which came after quite a period of very depressing Liberal Party performance during the 1980s, albeit from a broader economic liberalism perspective of the nation. Let's face it, the Hawke-Keating government actually embraced much of the economic liberal reform agenda that John Howard, as opposition leader or shadow treasurer, had promoted and supported. Yeah. As John Howard says, he said, well, Hawke and Keating probably wouldn't have achieved half what they did if he and the Liberals decided they would simply oppose every reform, which of course is what Labor did when John Howard became the Prime Minister and Peter Costello was the Treasurer. They opposed every sensible reform. So, do you think it's time for us to, as a party and a movement, look at what we stand for and a more detailed policy platform? Because I'm not sure many people at the moment would know what liberalism and conservatives or the non-socialists are on about, other than being opposed to things.
Well, in the end, a successful centre-right government is a problem-solving government. I don't think that centre-right political parties flourish when they agonise over the abstract, when they get so involved in debates about principle that they forget the practicalities. Certainly, as opposition leader, I looked at the practical problems that people faced. We obviously had the boat people crisis on our borders. We had massive wasteful spending throughout the Rudd-Gillard era. We had the hit on power prices from the carbon tax and the general attack on our prosperity through the mining tax. We had the paralysis when it came to delivering infrastructure. And that's why I had positive policies to deal with Labor's negatives.
Yes.
stop the boats, scrap the taxes, build the roads and fix the budget. So I think that's the important thing that centre-right political parties need to do. They need to be problem solvers, not airy-fairy debaters, so to speak. But at the same time, there have got to be some strong instinctual positions behind our approach to solving problems. Now, John Howard famously used to say that the Liberal Party was the political custodian in this country of the small L Liberal tradition of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty and the small c Conservative position of Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. The shorthand way of describing that was we are economically liberal and socially conservative. My own way of approaching it was to say that as Liberals we want smaller government, lower taxes, greater freedom. As Conservatives we support the family, small business and values and institutions that have stood the test of time. But above all else, we're patriots. We think that Australia is the best country on earth and we want to keep it that way. Now, I still think that these things are incredibly important. And yet there are too many Liberals, often in very senior positions, who don't seem to be committed to leaner, stronger government and empowered citizens, who don't seem to be committed to the values and the institutions that have stood the test of time, and seem to be afflicted by this cultural self-loathing, almost self-hatred, which has become epidemic in Western countries, particularly English-speaking countries, over the last couple of decades. I've always said that the Liberal Party is the Freedom Party, the Tradition Party and the Patriot Party, and yet too many Liberals don't really seem to be into freedom, don't really seem to be into tradition and don't really seem to be patriots anymore.
So what do you put that down to? Like, is there a problem that as a movement we stopped, as Menzies said, to continue to fight the battles against socialism? Is the way he put it. He said liberalism is in a constant battle with socialism, and while socialism may have changed, that we're not talking about nationalising the banks today, but we are talking about nationalising huge parts of the economy directly or indirectly, from the gas industry through to energy markets, the way the housing situation's been destroyed and where the government's looking to go, and all of our cultural institutions, which I would say have been quasi-nationalised and certainly taken over by neo-Marxists. So this battle against socialism, that in many ways it's almost as if Liberals have just waved the white flag or rolled over and let this happen.
Too often, David, in recent times, the Liberal Party's pitch has been Labor only a little less, Labor only a little better. So if Labor promises to spend $50 billion on something, we'll say, oh, that's too much, but we'll spend $40 billion. If Labor promises to cut emissions by 40%, we say, well, that's too much, we'll cut them by 30%, this kind of thing. Now, as I constantly said when we were in opposition, the job of the opposition is not to be a weak echo of a bad government, it is to be a strong and clear alternative. Our job is not to make weak compromises with a bad government, but to be a distinct, different alternative. Now, look, on energy policy, it's insane that we are closing down coal-fired power stations without a reliable alternative. It's insane that we are jeopardising our status as a secure place to invest by imposing price caps on gas and coal. It's just wrong that we are re-regulating our labour market to take it back to the 1970s. There are all of Labor's broken promises already on real wages, to not touch superannuation, to cut energy prices by $275 a year. And the first duty of the opposition is to point out in no uncertain terms exactly what the government is doing wrong, and then in good time before the next election to have a series of clear alternatives. Now, obviously, if we are going to reduce emissions as far and as fast as we can, we've got to look at nuclear power, which is the only currently feasible form of emissions-free baseload power, and I think we should be completely upfront about that. I mean, why beat around the bush?
Yep,
Let's say that we will immediately repeal the prohibition on nuclear power. I think that we really should be looking at things like the compulsory superannuation system. Let's face it, that money isn't the government's money, it's not the union-dominated super funds money, it's our money. Why should we be forced to give so much of it, particularly at a time of cost of living pressure? Why should we be forced to give so much of it to the government or the government's agents, the union-dominated super funds? Why can't we decide what to do with our money? One of the real problems at the moment, one of the things which I think is dismaying younger people, is this whole question of housing affordability. Now, we've got massive taxes, admittedly mostly state and local government taxes, but we've got massive taxes on housing. We've got massive restrictions on land release. I mean, this is a country that has more available land per person than any other country, and yet the price of a comparable house in most American cities is about half the price of a house
if that,
here
yes.
in Sydney and
I
Melbourne.
agree.
So I mean, there are so many paradoxes about modern Australia. We've got more readily available energy, and yet we've got the world's highest power prices. We've got more readily available land, and we've got amongst the world's highest housing prices. What are we doing to ourselves? I mean, plainly, there is something fundamentally awry in the way our governmental structures have been working for people, and there's no comprehensive centre-right critique and no comprehensive centre-right alternative. Now, the great thing about the Fight Back package, which you mentioned, it was an attempt to bring together a comprehensive whole-of-government improvement to the way things were in the Hawke-Keating years. And let's concede that the Hawke-Keating government, particularly the Hawke part of it, was the best Labor government, certainly the best peacetime Labor government we've ever had, because the Hawke government, when Keating was Treasurer, accepted that in the end it's the private sector that builds wealth. It's the private sector that pays higher wages. And this was a stunning and novel insight for the Labor Party, which sadly it's lost in the years since.
Very quickly.
But nevertheless, there was much that still needed to be improved upon at that time, and the Fight Back package was designed to be a comprehensive plan for government. And basically, we took every particular area of government. We said, what's government doing now that it shouldn't be doing? What's government not doing now that it should be doing? And what's government currently doing badly that it should do better?
Yes.
So we really looked at all of these policy areas from first principles and came up with some pretty amazing innovations and alternatives. And look, the Keating government took up some of those Fight Back proposals, particularly in the area of privatisation and a degree of labour market deregulation. And the Howard government took most of them forward to a pretty successful implementation. But there's been very little since then. I wanted, through the tax reform and federation reform white paper processes, to give us something like a fight back for these times. Unfortunately, as soon as I was dispatched, those reform processes were likewise dispatched.
So I agree with you that an opposition has to be as an alternative to the government, and you have to put forward a platform, and it needs to be based on underlying principles. And I think we know from Menzies, we know from Howard, even the Fraser government and your policies, all of which were underpinned by very sound liberal principles. So the policies you mentioned, you'd always say, well, that's entirely a solid liberal conservative policy, centre-right policy, because it comes from those principles you've espoused. Do you think one of the problems is the people who represent us today are not reflective of those views? You know, if they're not prepared to enter the ring and take up the fight for the values, the ideas, the policies that we have. And you were a very pugnacious member of Parliament for a long time. And I think Peter Dutton has that in him too, and John Howard. But around Howard, there were so many others. The Peter Reiths, the Peter Costellos, Alexander Downers, we could go on and on, Ruddocks. The Kemps, these people were always there on the front line, McLaughlin, fighting the case. And yet I see today, you know, Peter Dutton's trying to take a very principled position on the Voice and on some economic measures, on tax rises and the like, and he's almost all by himself, I feel. Do we have too many people who are careerists, time servers, weather vanes, whatever you want to call them there, who are just along for the ride but not prepared to join the battle?
Again, it's an excellent challenge, David. I was incredibly lucky in my public life because I got a very good education at school, at university, finally in Oxford, without wanting to say that I was a polymath or anything like that. I think I was reasonably familiar with history, reasonably familiar with elements of the canon. And then when I went off to university, I engaged in the battle of ideas on campus. The great thing about the Oxbridge system is that you have 2 days to research a topic and produce 1,000 or 1,500 word essay and defend it before one of the great minds in that discipline. And then, of course, my first real jobs in journalism involved writing editorials. And an editorial has got to take an issue of the day, swiftly analyse it, and then produce a well-argued conclusion. So I'd thought about a lot of these things, and I'd come to my own conclusions. Far too many people in public life today are corks tossed around on the sea of circumstance. They don't appear to have thought deeply about anything very much. They don't appear to have deep convictions about anything very much. I think another part of the problem is that far too many people seem to go straight from university into staffing, into Parliament, with a very narrow experience of life. And that compounds the lack of deep thought, the lack of real historical understanding and learning. And hence you see so much that is completely driven by short-term political advantage rather than by some conception of the long-term national interest. I often used to say that in politics you'll have wins and you'll have losses. What matters sometimes is less winning and losing, but fighting for a good cause. Some causes are worth losing for. I can remember John Hewson saying to me on my first day in his office, he said, I can live with losing the next election, but I couldn't live with going to the next election without a policy platform that I really believe in. Now, John had his failings as a politician, but I thought that fundamental statement that he made to his staff on that day was a wholly admirable one, and and was the source of the strength and the conviction in that fight back package.
So that's a really important word, I think, conviction, if I can pick up on that. And when going through Henry Kissinger's latest book on leadership, he chooses 6 examples, 2 of whom I admire highly in Margaret Thatcher and Lee Kuan Yew for different reasons. But he talks about courage and conviction, and you've picked up on conviction, and I think courage was probably lacking as well from what you're saying in many people. So when you were the opposition leader, and I dare say that you were the most effective opposition leader in the Liberal Party's history, and that's because you had courage and conviction. You were a very, very tenacious battler in the arena, shall we say. So, how do you look at today's situation? Similar circumstances. We haven't had 2 opposition leaders before Peter Dutton so far, which is probably welcome, because people forget that Peter Dutton's circumstances, he's not the 3rd opposition leader this term, he's our first one.
Yeah.
But
hopefully the last one.
Yes, exactly. So when you do that, when you think through what do I need to do, what was the lesson from when you're going through your mind then, and then reflecting, having the period in government, and then now we're back in opposition, what would be some of the lessons that you would pass to Peter, but also to Peter's colleagues and the broader membership and the supporter base, who are all pretty despondent and dismayed at the moment about where we're at?
Well, nothing galvanises a political party like a good fight. And it's got to be a good fight with the other side, not a good fight with your own.
Which we're good at that.
And I think that Peter has absolutely done the right thing by strongly opposing this divisive and potentially dangerous voice, Indigenous voice to the Parliament. We're all full of goodwill for Aboriginal people, and we all want a better deal for Aboriginal people, but this voice is not constitutional recognition. This is a power grab by the activist class,
yes,
and it needs to be resisted really furiously, frankly. And look, good on Peter Dutton for doing it, and let's hope his colleagues will show equal strength and mettle in this fight, because it's a fight we should get into, and it's a fight, frankly, for our country's sake, we must win.
I agree completely, and I think it was not only the principled decision to take, it was only pragmatic, practical, because as you say, I don't think government could work with a voice, not only to Parliament, it's a voice to the whole executive of government, and it's its own chapter which puts them on equal standing to those other arms of government.
Completely correct. And if the thing passes in its present form, we all know how the public service works. The public service will insist that the voice be given adequate notice, adequate information, adequate resources to make representations, which it will then insist the government adequately considers, which basically means that it will be a 4th arm of government. It will make the already incredibly constipated processes of government even worse, and quite apart from the fact that it will divide us by race or ancestry, it's going to make the whole business of government much less effective. So it's really a disastrous move, and I can't believe that so many people who do know better or should know better have decided to jump on the bandwagon because it's all too hard to do otherwise, and they don't want to be accused of being disrespectful to Aboriginal people. Well, frankly, sometimes you've just got to say no, and you've just got to accept that not everyone's going to like it, but for your country's sake and for your own self-respect, you've got to say no.
Sure. And the voice is, well, normally you put a referendum question, you would try to do so in a bipartisan manner. Of course, if you had any real prospect of wanting to get it up, that's what you would do. Now, clearly the government has chosen not to do that, so now it is a partisan
The government has
issue.
has weaponised this from the start. They've tried to weaponise it from the start. The Morrison government, which was very ambivalent about this whole issue of a voice, at least in its considerations, tried to be scrupulously bipartisan. There's been not the slightest sign of that from the current government, and they want to use this weapon as a weapon to discredit the opposition. Well, rather than temporise with the government, the opposition just needs to accept that this is a fight and win it.
A shameful political exercise, if that's what it is. So, you know, you had your 4 key areas, and they had cut-through lines. And so, first of all, I'd like to just ask you about what other areas there are for differentiation, and secondly, you were great at the grab. So, stop the boats, scrap the tax, fix the budget, build the roads.
Correct.
And now we have the 4 L's.
Labour light, Liberals lose. Yeah.
So if we're looking at the circumstances now, you know, you must think about what are the things that the Liberals should be looking at as cut through now. And of course that requires them to identify, well, what are the areas we're going to differentiate to be able to cut through on?
Well, energy policy, plainly, because that flows through to cost of living. The size of government, plainly, because that flows through to the fundamental dynamism of our economy. And by far the best policy that the Morrison government came up with was the super for housing policy. The pity of it was that it was too little, too late. And I think that's a very fruitful field for our party to be quite innovative in, because let's face it, why should ever more of our money be conscripted by these funds? Why indeed should any of our money be conscripted by these funds?
Well, thank you very much, Tony. I most appreciate your time and your wisdom, and let's hope some of your former colleagues can take that on board and enter the arena, and we'll see a greater battle of ideas and some more wins coming our way.
We can but hope.
That's true. Thank you very much, Tony.
Good on you, David. Thank you.
Joining.